Hi, welcome to Physionic, where we learn the body from the macro to the micro. If that's something you think you'd be interested in, then consider subscribing. Today's exam and content is related to sleep, which is something that I've received many requests on in the past, and I'm finally able to create some form of content related to how sleep impacts our health. So we're going to be covering how sleep has an association with a series of different factors like hypertension, your overall mortality, obesity, diabetes, sleep disorders, things of that nature, all in this particular piece. So without further ado, let's get into a short, sweet, science-based video. Let's jump into it. Alright, so let's get into this and introduce exactly what we're going to be covering. I think it's pretty self-explanatory to think that sleep is important for our daily function and for many different health outcomes. So this paper specifically looks at a few different things like hypertension, overall mortality, diabetes risk, obesity risk, and a few other factors like sleep disorder, which of course is tightly correlated with the amount of sleep that you get. I think that makes pretty intuitive sense. And finally, we're also going to be covering the number of hours that is considered optimal, or what's considered kind of the standard for lowering the risk in all of these different categories. So with that said, let's jump into the experimental methods. Unlike other papers, I don't have a whole lot to say when it comes to the experimental methods for this particular piece, mainly because this is a correlational study. So they looked at correlations of how sleep might affect or have some sort of connection with all of these different diseases that I mentioned in the introduction. That said, it does give us some insight, and they're actually looking at a bunch of different studies, and they're kind of picking out the most important figures and representing those and then explaining how that can be integrated with the amount of sleep that we get. So that's really all that we have to say there. It's not like they had, a specific population of subjects, that they had a control variable, and that they had a placebo and all that stuff like you would for a RCT study. But this is just kind of a long-term kind of looking over all the data across several different studies, so an analysis. All right, let's get the show on the road, talking about figure 1. So figure 1 is a housekeeping figure, essentially. Well, it's actually pretty important. I would say it's more than just housekeeping. It's kind of a base foundational understanding of how much sleep people get normally. So it gives you a distribution of how much sleep people are getting based on the hours. And what you find is that roughly, you could argue how much percentage it is, but 63 to 65%, somewhere in that range, of individuals get at least 7 hours of sleep. Now, the other part that they look at is sleep disorders. So, and what you'll find is that roughly, again, 65% of individuals have no sleep disorders, meaning that they don't suffer from something like insomnia. So that inevitably leaves us with 35% of individuals that have a sleep disorder of some sort, or in some cases multiple sleep disorders, but at least one. Now, there isn't a whole lot to say here other than I think it's interesting that at least 65% of individuals are getting 7 hours or more of sleep, and we see 65% of individuals have no sleep disorder. So is there a connection there? I don't know if that's what they're trying to get at in the actual figure that they showed there, but you could at least look at that and think, well, maybe there's some sort of connection there. So maybe that is what they were trying to get across. So figure 2 is a pretty interesting figure because it looks at the sex differences between men and women and their sleep habits. So how much sleep are they getting? So in terms of the amount of sleep, it tends to show that men tend to have less than 6 hours of sleep more consistently, or more men have less than 6 hours of sleep than women. So men suffer from less sleep than women. Now they looked at two different data sets. They looked at one from the 1980s and they looked at one from the 2000s. And you'll actually see that that actually stays consistent across both data sets. However, what is also really interesting is that there are more men that are sleeping less than 6 hours as we get closer to our timeline now. So this video is being shot in 2019. As we progress in time, we're seeing more and more men as well as women that are getting less than 6 hours of sleep. Now, something else that's really interesting about this graph is that because they stratify things based off of age, so it starts at 18 and goes to beyond 65 years of age with different sections for each age, what you'll find is that although you have more men that are sleeping less than 6 hours for the majority of life, right around the age of 65, it's actually more women that end up sleeping less than 6 hours. Now, why that might be the case? Well, that can really just be up to speculation. It could be some sort of menopausal change. It could certainly be because men are retiring or women are retiring, something to do with societal changes. It could be a vast number of different things leading to more women having less than 6 hours of sleep compared to men. Now, figure 3 is an especially interesting one because it's looking at really just mortality in general. So your hazard ratio or your risk of dying. And what they did was they clamped at 7 hours. So 7 hours being the standard, and then they based the hazard of dying off of that 7 hours. So if you sleep more than that or if you sleep less than that, they've kind of stratified it across to that. And of course, they've still also separated out men and women. And what's really interesting about this is that men tend to have a higher risk of mortality, or at least correlated with a higher risk of mortality at the lower end, so sleeping less than 7 hours. And for some reason, women tend to have a higher mortality with more than 7 hours. So if I can make kind of a glib little remark, men should be sleeping a little bit more and women should be sleeping a little bit less if they don't want to die. I know you can't really make that conclusion, but it's kind of just a funny observation based off of that particular graph. And one final note, on the very extreme, at the 3 hour mark, if women are sleeping 3 hours, women tend to have a far higher hazard ratio than men. So men tend to suffer the most when it comes to having lower than 7 hours of sleep. Unless you hit that 3 hour mark, then women suddenly have this much higher level. So those women specifically need to be sleeping a lot more than anyone else. Now on to figure 4, and you'll see that they're looking at hypertension. So they're looking at cardiovascular disease risk, heart disease risk. And what you'll find is that they're using 3 different models. And the first model is essentially just the raw data, what they collected or what that particular study, because again, this is just kind of a survey or an analysis study. The actual study that did the work is not this particular study. They're just taking this graph and presenting it and kind of making their case off of what another group of researchers have done. So what they found is that with model 1, which is kind of just the raw data, kind of just showing what came out just based off the numbers, no adjustments whatsoever, model 1 has some pretty interesting patterns. But we can't really look at model 1 because it's completely unadjusted. However, model 2, they did adjust for a variety of different things like race, sex, age, weight, things of that nature, to kind of get rid of some kind of extraneous variables or some variables that could have an impact. And it really does seem to have quite a severe impact, because the difference between model 1 and model 2, although the trend is there, the level or the actual effect is substantially lower. Now, that said, they also took it just one small step further with model 3, and they also included, along with all those other variables that I mentioned, they also mentioned sleep disorders, or they looked at sleep disorders and BMI. And what we find yet again, that if you clamp at 7 hours and then base all your analyses off of that 7-hour standard, then if you sleep less than 7 hours, then you have a higher risk of hypertension. If you sleep more than 7 hours, you have a higher risk of hypertension. So that 7 hours seems to be kind of a sweet spot when it comes to hypertension, at least based off of this graph. All right, moving on to figure 5, where they are relating BMI and sleep. What you find is that, again, within that range of 7 to 8 hours, you tend to have lower BMI. So if you are sleeping less than that 7 to 8 hour range, I think their number was around 7.7 hours, then if you sleep less than that, or if you sleep more than that, then you tend to have an elevated BMI. But again, keep in mind that these are associations. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you sleep 6.9 hours, you immediately start to gain weight or anything like that. It's not causative, it's just an association that they're showing. And finally, for figure 6, the last figure that we're going to be discussing, they look at the association between sleep and diabetes risk, or high blood glucose levels. And unsurprisingly, they find that between 7 to 8 hours, you tend to have the lowest levels of blood glucose levels compared to sleeping more or sleeping less. I think we can pretty much leave it there. Again, association, correlation does not necessarily mean that if you sleep 9 hours a day, that automatically means that your blood glucose levels are going to be higher. It's just an association that people that tend to sleep 7 to 8 hours in that range tend to have lower blood glucose levels. Now that could be from other factors, it's just that sleep is related to that. Okay, so in conclusion, kind of talking about all 6 figures, what can we conclude? Can we conclude that sleep causes hypertension, cancer, overall mortality risk, diabetes, high BMI, sleep disorders, all this kind of stuff that we already went over? The answer is no, we can't. Because even though we went through all those different diagrams showing all this different evidence for each one of these conditions, it's still a correlation. It's still an association, so we can associate sleep to it, and that's exactly what they did. Their variable was sleep, and then they changed all the other variables, and they wanted to see how those relate to one another. And then, of course, they looked at age, sex, and they, of course, also looked at the sleep number, so the amount of time that people slept throughout the night. And still, it's an association. So it could be other factors. That's the thing. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. That although sleep, if you control for sleep, are there going to be other factors that could have as much or a greater impact? We don't know, but the answer is most likely yes. So things like BMI, if you, let's say, oversleep. So let's say you sleep 10 hours, and that is technically, according to this study, correlated with having higher BMI, so having a higher weight. And well, maybe that's because you aren't exercising. So you're removing some of that exercise time that you could have had because you're oversleeping, or in a situation in which you are not sleeping enough. So you're getting 4 hours of sleep and your blood glucose levels are higher. Is that necessarily because of the sleep? I'm sure it's a contributing factor, no doubt, but it could also be something else. It could be something like you just don't feel motivated to stick to your nutrition. You don't feel like you have the motivation to be able to meal prep or to stick to a particular diet because you suffer from insomnia and you only get a few hours of sleep every night. And that, again, could have a direct impact as well on your blood glucose levels, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's the only factor involved. And you could do this, going on and on and on with all these different factors like hypertension. That would be another one. If you overconsume, if you're up later at night, then you could maybe overconsume, leading to weight gain, and you only get 3 hours of sleep, but because you're only getting 3 hours of sleep, you're awake longer. And if you're awake longer, you're bored, maybe you're watching TV, maybe you're reading a book, and you're snacking during that time, and that slowly leads to incremental weight gain. It could be, again, the point is that it could be in a number of different factors, but certainly if you look at sleep, that there is an association. And it seems that what we can take away is that if we naively think of sleep having a substantial impact on all these different factors, as in being causative, which, let's be real, it's going to have a substantial impact, but is it the only impact? Again, the point being no. Even so, getting roughly 7 to 8 hours of sleep seems to be about right for most individuals across a wide number of factors. So in the end, what we really need to do is look at a randomized controlled trial, and that randomized controlled trial can look at sleep and its direct impact on one of these variables. And then you would need a control trial for each one of the variables, and then look at different biomedical markers to see how varying levels of sleep based off of these different factors like sex and age, how that can impact biomedical markers that we can measure that would be representative of that factor. So for like hypertension, you would look at like blood pressure, or you look at cholesterol levels or something along those lines. So going forward, that's probably what we need to do, but this is certainly a good setup study so that we can base things, kind of have a direction to go in. All right, well, with that said, hopefully you found this examine content useful to you, informative to you, and I hope that I have the pleasure of speaking with you in the very next one. Have a good one, guys. Bye.